Hey, welcome back to the Any Given Day podcast. A little more lonely in the quote studio today because I am your host. And I guess I'm also your guest, or my own guest. I don't need to know. Honestly, I guess I'm not going to be interviewing myself, so we'll just call it the host. And I'm going to be honest, I've got, I'm holding it up for those watching, but we're holding the back of it up so they still can't see it, but gesturing to this notepad, because I do have a few notes scribbled, but I'd be absolutely lying if I said I was prepared for this. Full disclosure, I'm hours from when this usually posts. The original idea here for episode 10 was going to be a summary episode of the first 9, basically saying, taking a look through them, finding some common themes or even just one common underlying theme, and then sort of exploring or deep diving that, maybe from a little bit of coaching perspective, maybe some personal perspective, a combination thereof. I'm even 2 episodes ahead. Actually, we've got 11 and 12 already recorded, ready to go, and I'm pretty stoked to release those. But I still wanted to at least hold true to 10. But the reason, or a reason, I guess, that I'm not prepared is, life be lifing. And some wrenches certainly got thrown into the weekend. We had a hockey tournament going on, and it was over an hour away, and several iterations of back and forth, not to mention some wild weather here in Colorado where we had, yesterday was mid 70s. I think they said 73. My thermostat said 75. And then a sudden drastic drop overnight, to say the least. And the cold and the snow rolled in. So we got a few inches of snow, depending on where you're living. And then the temperature actually dropped into the mid 20s. So you're talking about literally a 50-degree swing over the course of just overnight. But on top of that, we had a little bit of a tough morning here at the Palin household that I'll get into here momentarily. And that is kind of, I guess, feeding into some of the theme of what I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about. And honestly, this is expected or intended to be a shorter episode. I kind of hope it is, to be honest. Part of that being just my energy levels at this point, and part of it too being the emotional bandwidth. Anyway, gonna talk at you for a bit, and we'll see kind of where we land. But I think for anyone that's listened, through the first 9 episodes of the Any Given Day podcast, the idea behind this podcast initially and still, right, was to bring on guests who could highlight the touching of the flame. And I didn't necessarily want folks who are living in the extremes, because I do think that touching the flame is a relative term. And I think it just means kind of, stretching your comfort zone for the sake of growth. And I think we've really seen that, like all the way from episode 1 with Jason Clark, who really set the tone when he was talking about never finding the peak. And then we've had this sort of ongoing conversation around the value of discomfort, but still continuing to find a tribe after service. And even then, like finding a tribe, there can be some discomfort in that. So I think what we're really seeing is, or hearing, if you're listening and not watching, though I am surprised how many people are watching, which is cool. Maybe I should start dressing better and work on a better background for this thing with all you folks that are watching. But I think the theme we're really seeing here, right, is the idea of not just life after service, but continuing to find opportunities for growth after service. And the events that unfolded here at home this morning that I'll share momentarily kind of inadvertently revealed to me anyway some of the growth that I've experienced. So some have been in talks I've had where, and I might have even mentioned it on a podcast before, at least a piece of it, where, and some of you right now, by the way, are seeing me open my phone texting folks, but I am pulling up a text that I hope to not forget to reference, which is why I'm opening it. But when I think about resilience, and everyone talks about resilience in terms of kind of bend but don't break, right? Like bounce back type of thing. And I've sort of argued that there's layers to this, right? So I think part of resilience is in the presence of certain stressors, I don't think we should bend. I think we should have some armor built where we can actually resist. And I won't turn this into a class, but I do want to emphasize kind of these three layers from my perspective of resilience. And then there's rebound, which is sort of what I've already alluded to, kind of that traditional thought around resilience: bend but don't break. And then I also do believe that there is a third layer to resilience, which I'm going to hope to remember to come back to. And that's what ties to this open text now sitting down here in my lap. So going back to what I've laid out so far: resist, so that armor building keeps things from getting in, and then rebound. Well, I think a lot of us get really, really comfortable during our time in service, especially those who have deployed to combat, been exposed to fairly aggressive, violent, traumatic events involving, severe injury, death, etc. We rely heavily on that resist strategy, right? Part of that is sort of the compartmentalization, I'm going to put it over here and I'm going to deal with it later. If I think back to, without this becoming war stories, if I think back to few of the more, traumatic or violent instances that I was a part of, certainly never really engaged with it at a deep level. So I remember there was sort of a memorial of sorts for a good friend of mine who died overseas, and we're still downrange. And I was asked to say a few words. And, I remember trying to find the line of, hey, I want this to be heartfelt, and I want to do, my friend and my leader justice, but I also don't really want to feel. And, part of that is quite literally we're queuing up the next mission, and I'm in front of a room full of folks who are badass motherfuckers, right? And I don't want to be up there unraveling, in front of them. Quite honestly, like you just didn't really have time for that shit. And so, I said my piece, and I feel good about the words that I've shared. And I do remember fighting back some feelings in the moment and almost even being frustrated with myself for feeling like maybe I exposed too much emotion. But quite frankly, I really doubt that I did if I were to go back in that room and witness that event. And then I think forward to kind of the next time that there was a traumatic event, basically a mass casualty event with a lot of wounded, some severely, some not so much. Nobody died, thankfully, in this instance. But, I was left in that moment as sort of the senior enlisted leader on the ground. So again, I'm working through, logistics. I'm pissed off because the manifest that I have isn't updated, and I'm trying to get accountability, and we're trying to evacuate casualties and all of these things. And then later that night, I'm back in the hospital, and I'm, surrounded by, quite frankly, carnage, of friendlies. And similar there. I mean, some of these guys, fucking crazy bastards, but, they're severely wounded and still slinging jokes and still being as inappropriate as ever. And so there was levity there, right? We leaned into that levity, and then going back to kind of brief the rest of the platoon alongside other leadership, they needed strength in that moment. They did not need, vulnerable, staff sergeant, so to speak. So again, like, there wasn't even really much bending there. Probably all of that was more of resistance. And quite frankly, I held on to that strategy through the entirety of my civilian life. I'm pretty far removed now, 16 years service. But if I think back to the friends that I've lost, both while in and while gone, some due to combat, some suicide, some other pieces of the world that got to them in one way or another. Even my two grandmothers who passed, when I was a little bit of an older adult. Quite honestly, I've laid to rest 2 marriages. And through all of this, I don't think that I ever really felt any of it, I don't think that I gave myself a reason to rebound or show resilience. And in fact, I probably went, more of a numbing route, certainly leaning into alcohol, leaning into stubbornness, leaning into dark humor, all of the things that a lot of us do versus wanting to, deal with our shit, so to speak. So thinking, I guess, of growth after service in all the ways that I would say I was growing professionally, even personally and academically and all of this other stuff, there was a lot of ways that I was refusing to grow. And I don't think I know that this story is certainly not unique to me, right? Which kind of brings me then to the last piece, which is when we can't resist something anymore and we're not bouncing back from it, in part because we're not letting it affect us enough to actually engage with it and deal with it in a healthy way. At some point, you lose. At some point, the stress becomes too much. At some point, you break down, you collapse, you shatter, whatever it is. And you have to, in that moment, rebuild. And when you rebuild, you need obviously some new parts, but you're obviously still building on pieces of the life that you had put together up to that point, which means some good, some bad. And you got to figure out how to use what and what to keep and what to throw away with the hope of building something that maybe is a little bit more robust. Anyway, all of this to say, it brings me to Matt Luke, who was a lot of our favorite episode. And honestly, I think, which is tough to say because I've had so many good friends on. And Matt, actually, I probably know less than anybody else. But man, did his episode really move me. So it was super powerful. But, he sent me an awesome text this morning that I'm pulling up now. And, and he even said, actually, pass it along to your viewers and our friends. So he said, and I believe this is from an audiobook that he's listening to. And I don't know what the book is. I'll find out. If I remember, maybe I'll throw it in the show notes. But he said, rock bottom isn't a permanent address. It's just a foundation on which you can build something entirely new. Now, as you'll see from kind of our text exchange after, which I'm also going to share, I don't know that it's entirely new what we're building, because it is still rooted in pieces of whatever was there before, especially if we're building in the same spot. And I believe we are, because I believe that spot is our life. And, I told him that I love that, and that for some, rock bottom might even be an essential starting point for finding a sustainable way forward. But he brought up kind of a good caveat to that, which is that everyone's rock bottom is different. And this is me quoting him now. He said, I think for most, measurable bottom is key. It's never about escaping, right? Or going back to a past or old identity, but rather building something different from it. Man, I love that. I'm going to read that again for everybody. So he said, it's never about escaping or going back to a past or old identity, but rather building something different from it. And so, on that note, that kind of had me, this is literally, by the way, this is from literally from this morning. Sorry. Feel like I have had a few times, and maybe a lot of us have experienced this, where we have had this feeling of growth, this feeling of progress, this feeling of I'm in a better place mentally, physically, emotionally, etc. And I think that from a physical perspective, it's really easy to measure, right? Like what's my body composition? What's my sleep? What do you bench, bro? That type of stuff. So I think it's really easy to measure. So a lot of us lean in, to the physical element. And then I think when we talk mentally, emotionally, one, it's hard to separate the two sometimes, and it's definitely difficult to measure most. So I think a lot of times we have to have a little bit of faith that we've experienced some growth in one or the other. And I certainly, people have asked me recently, like, "Hey, how you doing? How you feeling?" And I'm like, "Man, like life is good. It's best it's ever been." I'm trying not to screw that up, so to speak. But I think part of it too, if I'm being honest, I don't know that life has really been tested. And and so sometimes it can kind of be hard to tell, like, am I in a better place than I was? Like, sure, you know, you you're it's easy, for example, I don't really drink anymore. And so I could look at that as a sign of like, oh, like sobriety, that's showing that I'm doing good. But is it also just because things are good? And so I don't need that, crutch to kind of lean on or whatever it is. So anyway, I guess with all this rebuilding, just sometimes you wonder if what, you're building is different, is new, stronger, better, more resilient than what stood in its place before, especially because no matter how much you try, you're not building without pieces of the past. Some of those pieces I think have to come with you. I think they can serve as valuable reminders. Anyway, I'm getting on a bit of a tangent, but I want to bring it back to the morning here. So fairly early morning. I'm not sure exactly what time, but our pet dog Bobo, who joined Lachlan and I's lives by way of Megan, my girlfriend. So she lives with Bo lives with us all here in the house. And, I want to say he's been in Megan's family for quite a while, was her brother's dog, and ended up kind of becoming her parents' dog. And then around 6-ish years ago, she took over responsibility for Bo. And man, he's just been the most awesome of family dogs. Like he's loving. He's certainly very clingy, to say the least, especially with Megan, except when she goes out of town and he realizes that, I got to be the one to feed him. Then he starts loving me a little bit more. But, he's great. He's great. And he's especially been amazing with Lachlan with, letting him love him, but also teaching a young kid kind of boundaries. And, he'll let him know when he's uncomfortable, but he does it, in a safe and loving way. And so, a lot of you probably seen Bo even just through my social media or whatever, but he's definitely been a special part of our lives. And, he's been getting older, 13, struggling a little bit physically as of late. He had a really tough day last weekend, but he kind of bounced back, during the week. And we sort of thought that he had a renewed, life going, even if he's a little less energy than usual. But, unfortunately this morning, Bo was downstairs with Lachlan and I early morning while Megan was still upstairs. And, he collapsed on the floor there in front of us. And, I kind of quickly went down to hold him and help him. And I could tell that he was sort of seizing up and maybe in a little bit of pain, and maybe a little bit afraid. And Lachlan actually jumped down on the floor with me, and we were both kind of holding and hugging him. And, I called up to Megan because I had certainly the sense it was pretty obvious that Bo wasn't doing well and that there was a good chance that he might pass away. I thought maybe stroke, maybe heart attack. I wasn't sure which. And so, Megan came down and she was able to spend time holding Bo as well. And so Lachlan kind of moved away for a bit, and Megan and I were holding Bo and crying, and you could tell he was on his way out, and his heartbeat went from faint to non-existent. And Lachlan was amazing, man. For those that don't know, Lachlan's my 7-year-old son, and he came over and he started to console Megan. And anyway, we, of all the ways for something like that to happen, it there is no good way. But, with as nervous as Bo is with the vet and all of that kind of thing, I'm glad it didn't come down to, say, a decision or having to bring him into a vet or something like that. It was in our home. It was surrounded by unconditional love of the family that Bo has given so much to. And so in a way, I'm thankful for how Bo passed, and never know how like a 7-year-old, for example, is going to handle something like that. But it was kind of beautiful, to be honest, just to see Lachlan kind of, one, figuring it out, but two, just being so generous with his soul and so loving and so consoling and caring for both Bo and Megan. And, we kind of offered for Lachlan to say goodbye to Bo. And then I took him over to his mom's. And when, we went out and got in the truck, I'd been kind of, to be honest, crying off and on. And I realized when we got into the truck that a few things. One, I think much in the way that many of us do during service, in the moment, compartmentalize things, handled it sort of, as, I don't know, a leader or a caregiver would, in terms of rationally and calmly and making fairly quick decisions. But something a little different was as things kind of settled and the realization came that Bo had passed, and kind of maneuvering Megan's emotions and Lachlan's emotions and everything, and my own, I felt it. I felt all of it. I cried, did not try to suppress any emotions. I felt every moment of the morning with incredible clarity and sadness, but also love. And I realized all that, I guess, as I got into the car, because I realized that I need to talk to this 7-year-old about what just happened and kind of make sure he's okay. And, the first thing I said to him, I said, dude, it's absolutely okay for us to cry. Like, let's have a good cry, man. And we did, you know, and, he had some questions and all of that. And we composed ourselves and, brought him over to his mom's, and the day kind of went from there. But, I say all that to say that when we rebuild, don't know the beauty of what we built until it's tested. And while I realize some of you listening are going to be more understanding and more empathetic than others when it comes to a dog's life, it is wild to me that if I were to say list the 10 humans that I've lost in the last, say, 16 to 20 years, I don't think cumulatively I gave them the emotions that I gave Bo this morning. And I think it's because I didn't have the foundation that I have now. I hadn't built something that was truly emotionally resilient where I would let it bend because I could rebound. And so instead, I just resisted everything with strategies that I think are fine for the short term, but I don't think they're sustainable. So I guess for me, growth after service sure as shit took long enough to start to achieve some of this. Feel the feels, cry, fucking cry. Sometimes you just have to. I don't know that I'll go back and unpack and engage with depth with things that, quite honestly, most of what I am now is built upon. But I am going to recognize how I didn't give the emotions that I probably should have. And I guess my advice then would be for folks who have some things in their lives that are a little bit fresher, when the time is right, because you can't always in the moment, but when the time is right, do engage with it. Do let yourself feel the fucking feelings. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's healthy. It's healthy. It doesn't mean that they own you and that you ruminate and that you spend the rest of your life stuck in some bullshit sadness. No. But it means for long enough to be vulnerable so that you can then take ownership of your response to those feelings, because you cannot respond appropriately to something that you don't even acknowledge. Anyway, I know this has gotten a little bit serious, a little bit somber. Like I said, a little bit of a tough way to start the morning, but I want to pull something positive out of it. Really appreciate everybody who's been listening, who's been giving some killer feedback. We've got a lot more phenomenal folks lined up to talk to, just real people, some veterans, some not. The idea behind this podcast is wisdom and stories from and for veterans, for those looking to continue to touch the flame after service. I don't think it's always that we touch the flame and don't get burnt. I think sometimes we do. And when we do, we have to acknowledge that sensation. And that is how we're going to build the scars that we need to be more resilient the next time that we touch that same flame. I appreciate you all. Take care.